Hi, Denver Startup Week. I'm Ben Data, one of the co-chairs of DSW. Denver Startup Week is the largest free entrepreneurial event in the world, and it's only possible thanks to the support of our sponsors. We have nearly 50 sponsor companies who contribute to make DSW possible. Let's show our love for these companies today and all week long. Thanks to our HQ and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors, whose leadership makes this week come to life. Capital One Cafe, Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork. And our track sponsors who have made all the great content you're hearing today possible. Founder Track sponsor, Kickstart. Growth Track sponsor, Friday Health Plans. Developer Track sponsor, Quizlet. Product Track sponsor, Palantir. Design Track sponsor, Battery 621 and the Public Works. People Track sponsor, Exactly. And Spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement this week. Thank you to B-Side Fun, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing Company, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, Gusto, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage Path, Red Bull Basement, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our partner sponsors and member sponsors listed on the screen. Thank you for your support of Denver Startup Week. Now, let's get to it.
Only 6% of U.S. retail businesses have a Black owner. That needs to change. So I did something. I created a Black Business Accelerator at Amazon. And now we have a program that's dedicated to making tomorrow a better day for Black businesses.
This is really good quality.
I am Tiffany, and this is just the beginning.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Diane Miles, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion co-chair and member of the Denver Startup Week Organizing Committee. As a committee, we acknowledge Indigenous people as the original owners of the land on which we reside, which is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced removal, stolen land, and forced occupation of their territory. And we honor those who have stewarded this land throughout generations and all other Indigenous tribes and nations who call Colorado home. Thank you for joining us for the 10th anniversary of Denver Startup Week. At Denver Startup Week, we strive to make all of our sessions a space where attendees can connect, learn, and grow, regardless of age, gender identity, gender expression, race, ability, sexual orientation, or a combination of those identities. There is something for everyone at Denver Startup Week. Thanks to all of our community members who submitted their best content to make this week what it is. Thank you to our sponsors for their support in helping us to keep DSW free and accessible for all. With that, please enjoy this session and the entire week.
Good afternoon, all. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this session. My name is Alan Frosh. I am the co-owner and chief community officer at Tattered Cover Bookstore in Denver. Really pleased to be here with this excellent panel talking about the book System Error. It is my pleasure to introduce our panelists real quickly. Then we'll dive right into the topic, which could not be more relevant and appropriate today. These are three individuals from Stanford. First, we have Rob Reesh, who is a philosopher, the director of Stanford University's Center for Ethics and Society, co-director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and associate director of Stanford's new Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Next, we have Mehran Sahami, who was recruited to Google in its startup days by Sergey Brin and is one of the inventors of email spam filtering technology and is now an associate chair for education in the computer science department. Lastly, we have Jeremy Weinstein, who is a political scientist and who went to Washington with President Obama in 2009 and is now a professor of political science at Stanford. Thank you all for being here. We are thrilled to have you at Denver Startup Week and representing a very important area of focus in this day and age. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot.
Let's jump right in. Why this book? Why the three of you? And why is this topic so relevant today?
Well, let's start with the obvious. The Facebook whistleblower is testifying before Congress today and exposing the sort of dark secrets that were known internally to Facebook about the research from, generally speaking, data scientists and PhD social scientists employed by Facebook about various aspects of how the Facebook social media newsfeed and other aspects of Instagram and WhatsApp were causing various forms of social harms. And we came together 4 years ago here on campus to pilot a new course that integrated ethics, social science, and policy and technology in order to take stock of the extraordinary power grab that big tech has basically exercised over our lives, and to understand the extraordinary benefits it can bring us, as well as the extraordinary harms it can impose on us. And we think that by bringing these three perspectives together and having a book that draws from the course but now communicates to a broader audience is a way for all of us to basically come to terms with the power of big tech and to stop what's been a dominant narrative for the past 30 years, which is that the technologists on their own will fix the problem. We had a long period in which tech was going to liberate us all and spread democracy around the world, and then 5 years in which it's been nothing but doom and gloom, where we have apology tours from the CEOs saying our best people are working on the problem. And part of the spirit of our book is to crack open what we think is happening independent of us, a new era in which there's going to be external regulation, there's going to be efforts from within companies and tech workers, there's going to be civil society efforts to begin to steer tech in a direction that's different than what has happened in the past.
Rob, thank you. Jeremy is the resident policy expert on this team. Can you talk about how the book addresses this, and then what today's testimony and the recent revelations mean for the policy implementation in Washington, where big tech is concerned?
So today is obviously a hinge moment in the relationship between the public and tech firms, but also between Congress and the tech firms. What you've seen over the last 3 hours in Washington is credible insider accounts backed by research and documentation of the ways in which Facebook in particular has systematically ignored the social and individual harms of technology and prioritized its own profits. Now, what I want to do to put today's moment in perspective is say that in our book, System Error, part of what we argue is that what's on display with Facebook is actually a systemic problem. It is not a problem that can be reducible to a single company or to the individuals at the leadership of a company. That we can be talking about any tech company and you could replace Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg with others and the same problems would potentially replicate themselves. And that's because the moment that we're at, where technology yields extraordinary benefits, but also evident social harms, is a function of three key ingredients in particular. The first is the excessive focus on optimization that governs the work of engineers and computer scientists. And you saw this discussion on display today and in the Facebook files published in Wall Street, where there were discussions about what was it that the company was optimizing for, meaningful engagement on the platform, time on the platform, and what were the potential trade-offs as those criteria were set in terms of harms to individuals, in terms of harms around the kinds of toxicity of the environment. So the optimization mindset, the orientation towards optimizing one thing while ignoring all of the other things that are potentially at stake, is at the core DNA of technology companies founded by computer scientists and engineers. The second ingredient is venture capital, and the way that venture capital takes what is being optimized for individuals and scales it to society very quickly, right? And generates basically a set of social harms that are experienced by large numbers of people because of the focus on sort of scaling technologies quickly, dominating markets, and finding those unicorns. And that means that the kind of diligent work that's needed to weigh the value trade-offs that are implicit in tech, to think about benefits and harms, isn't done before these products are rolled out at scale. And then the third ingredient is the deliberate indifference of Washington to the growing power of big tech since 1995. No meaningful regulation, no orientation towards really policing the growth of concentrated power, no effort to unearth the hidden algorithms that are making decisions that are generating these kinds of harms. And so those are the three systemic ingredients that bring us to this moment. And what makes me optimistic on a day like today with powerful testimony, credible insider accounts, is that We need not just sort of bespoke solutions to these problems that are primarily about fixing Facebook or fixing Twitter, but we need a recognition that the value trade-offs that are embedded in tech are value trade-offs that need to be weighed in public deliberation and by our democratic institutions, rather than behind the scenes decisions made by technologists alone who build products or made in the C-suite by corporations that have a primary interest in maximizing their bottom line, but insufficient concern for the social effects. So we can get into the details, but the hinge moment that we're at today, and it even was reflected in Facebook's statement, is that we are long overdue to bring these conversations into the public domain and to have democratic deliberation about how we balance the benefits and harms of technology.
Jeremy, thank you. And we'll get to that next step in a little bit, but I want to go to Mehran for a second. Why are you three the right ones to write this book and talk about contributing your individual expertise areas into this conversation around the challenges or the evils of big tech?
I think it's important to keep in mind that there's lots of voices that need to actually be brought into this conversation. So we're three people with three different disciplinary lenses who came together to teach a class to write this book. But I think it's important to keep in mind that really, if we want to solve large systemic problems, what we need is multiple perspectives, certainly beyond the three of us. That's something we talk about in the book, where we try to lift other voices. Because if we look at Stanford, for example, is the seedbed of Silicon Valley. When we look around in terms of what is coming out of Stanford and what we can do to impact the next generation of technologists, that's how we got involved, as Rob alluded to, in terms of building this class. But as we dig more and more into the details, one of the things you find in lots of the different issues that we discuss in the book is that oftentimes the people who are the first ones to really grapple with those issues are the ones most deeply affected by it. For example, much of the work that was done in the early days to show that facial recognition systems were racially biased was actually done by Joy Buolamwini and Timnit Gebru, who are both Black women, because they saw that, in fact, these systems worked far less well on Black women or Blacks in general than they did for the white population, for example. And so what we actually need is that diversity really brought into these conversations. We try to highlight some of that in the book, but really to reach the solutions that we want to get to is a much broader conversation than just the three of us.
Absolutely. And I think that the framework through which Jeremy provided context for this conversation might be good for us to explore a little bit more. So first, why don't we talk about the optimization mindset and just give everyone here kind of a fundamental explanation of what that is. Rob, why don't we hear from you first?
Sure. Well, one of the things which, I'm guessing if Denver Startup Week, a lot of people in the audience will at least have a familiar ring to it. What technologists tend to learn, what engineers tend to learn in their very education, is that they're looking to optimize a solution to a particular problem. And the optimization mindset within a technological domain has a lot of potential and power to it. We're not against the optimization mindset as such. The way it works is that you take an objective, it's sometimes an objective function if you're talking about an algorithmic model, and you're looking to optimize a solution to it so far as you can. And what we point out in the book, and what I, as a philosopher, what I would point out to anyone who feels like optimization is so important, it brings us such benefits, is that optimization is nothing more than a means to try to accomplish a particular end or goal. And what that suggests, even on quick reflection, is that if you optimize for a bad outcome, you're actually making the world worse, not better. And so that's point number one about the problem of the optimization mindset. You have to be confident that you're focusing at least as much on the worthiness of the goal or the objective function, rather than just thinking optimization is a hammer and we'll take it to every single problem we find. The second part of optimization, and here I'll just give you a couple examples, is that finding the most efficient solution or optimal solution to particular problems is not always what we want from a social perspective. There are often times when there are other things that matter. As Jeremy said, there are other values. And if we only optimize for the accomplishment of one value, we can lose out socially on the other things we care about. So just trivial examples. We don't construct our roadway system so that we optimize the time in which we can get from point A to point B. We put speed bumps in certain places in order to take account of safety concerns. If you're deliberating on a jury, the judge doesn't tell you, please make sure to optimize the time or the vote. They say, be sure to converse with each other in order that you exchange your reasons. It slows the process down. If you think about our elections, there are lots of social scientists and pollsters who could, with a high degree of confidence in many elections at least, predict the outcome before the polls have closed. And yet the media generally has a norm that says we will not report our projections until all the polls have closed. We slow things down, in other words, because optimizing everything is not always good. The final piece of it is that I'd say when you've got an obsession with the optimization mindset, it sometimes breaks out of the technological world or the engineering world and becomes an outlook for life. You start talking about, as one colleague of ours at Stanford teaches in a computer science class about optimization, that everything in life is an optimization problem. And when you see the world that way, you start thinking about life hacking and getting things done, and you're looking to optimize every aspect of your own personal life. That can lead, we think, to a tension with democracy itself. So if you're obsessed with optimization, you often hear democracy is slow, it's dysfunctional, it slows things down. Let the technocratically oriented do-gooders, or people who know how to solve problems, get into the mix and solve the problems better than the slow working of democracy. And what that misses is that democracy is never intended to be an optimizing solution. It is a technological arrangement, but not for optimizing something. It's a technological arrangement for refereeing persistent disagreements amongst citizens and giving us a chance every few years to elect a new crop of politicians, or to have our own voices represented in the process, to try again if we don't like the current outcome. So I'll just share at the end of all this a story that illustrates this last problem for me, that in a certain extreme circumstance, the optimization mindset produces people who are deeply suspicious of democracy. I got invited to a salon dinner a couple of years ago with a bunch of familiar names in the venture capital world and the technology world. And the topic of the dinner, it was announced, was, what would it be like if we could find somewhere on Earth that was devoted to the maximal progress of science and technology? And there was immediate conversation around the table. Oh, should we have an island, or do we need to put it somewhere else? How do we establish who gets to be admitted as a citizen to this new place on Earth? And as things went around the table, after I heard a bunch of the conversation, I raised my hand and said, I'm the political philosopher here. I'm just curious, what's the governance arrangement? What are the politics of this place devoted to the maximal progress of science and technology? Is this a democracy? And the nearly uniform response was, oh my gosh, absolutely not a democracy. This is a place where the technocrats are in political power, because democracy just holds things back. And I think when you think about the libertarian mindset of many of the technological founders and visionaries in Silicon Valley, libertarianism looking to minimize the role of government, resist regulation at every turn, and the optimization mindset of their employees, what you get is optimizing for libertarianism, optimizing for the minimal role of the government, keep the state at bay, which is to say, deep distrust of democracy itself. And that's one of the main parts of the problem that we're in today.
Rob, thank you. And that's a great dovetail into the question I have for Jeremy, which really does focus on one of the pieces that you mentioned earlier. It appears that, as Rob mentioned, there's a mindset among the tech community about limited regulation, being able to build and grow without government intervention. One, is democracy even up for the task of regulating tech? And two, if they are, or if it is, if the democratic process is, what can be done about that?
So one of the things that we do in the book is we trace the history of what we call the kind of race between disruption and democracy. This is, we're in a moment right now that feels like the first moment where we've had to grapple with, the slow and deliberate pace of democratic institutions and the challenge of technology outracing, our politicians. But of course, this isn't a new story. This was the story of the telegraph. This was the story of the telecommunications industry, and now it's the story of the internet economy and social media. And so what we see historically is, innovation driven by the private sector, That's part of the American model and part of what really stands out in comparison to the rest of the world. Extraordinary new innovations that improve lives in countless ways, but then also the development of societal harms and effects that are observed from these technologies or from the market power that basically consolidates around these technologies that ultimately then generates a regulatory response. And so we feel that right now, and you saw it on display today, that we are entering that regulatory moment. Just like we did with the telegraph and just like we did with the telecommunications industry, a moment where on the table is a recalibration of the relationship between the state, between government institutions, and the power that's embedded in tech companies over the products that they produce. And that's really because of this pretty simple concept that economists have developed called externalities, that there are basically social consequences of the individual choices that people are making to use or not use technology, and the design choices that the firms are making, that like the protection of clean water and clean air, we now need to think about those externalities when it comes to people's well-being, when it comes to the health of our democracy, when it comes to the protection of people's commitments to fairness and justice, when it comes to algorithmic decision-making. So government does need to step up. The question is how, and I think one important thing, you will be hearing today in the news, government or companies saying, it's time for regulation, it's time for regulation. Actually, we've been hearing that from Microsoft, Facebook, and Google for years, at the same time that they've been fighting regulation behind the scenes, right? Fighting regulation with high-paid lobbyists who are the primary source of technical know-how and expertise to our members of Congress. And so we need to get serious and we need to get focused. And part of what we do in the book is outline a number of domains in which we think regulatory steps are the low-hanging fruit, okay? That there is bipartisan consensus, even in our difficult and polarized and dysfunctional politics. And those are around things like data privacy laws in the United States that mirror the protections that have been afforded to European citizens. Commitments to data portability, to basically reduce the power of platforms over each of us by their ability to own whatever data that we produce and not bring our networks and our information from one platform to another. Transparency around algorithmic decision-making, both in the public sector when algorithms are being used to make decisions about hiring or access to loans or access to important services, but also transparency around algorithms in the private sector, especially as we think about things like bias and harm. And you saw the whistleblower today bring to the surface all sorts of information that Facebook had about its algorithm, not the internal details of how the algorithm functioned, but assessments of its potential harms that were being misrepresented in some ways to investors. And then, of course, another piece of low-hanging fruit is sort of how do we think about addressing the impact of AI on our workforce? What kinds of investments do we need to make in education, reskilling, support for those who are displaced? These are all low-hanging fruit. Both parties should be able to get behind them. But we're also at a critical moment where there are going to be areas of disagreement. And Rob is absolutely right that we argue that having these disagreements in the public sphere, in our democratic institutions, is the right place to have them. What's the future of a government role in the oversight of content moderation? What's the future of a government role on questions of antitrust enforcement? These are two of the most central and hotly debated issues of our time. The three of us have views on the right place to end up, but maybe the most optimistic thing to say on a day like today is finally those issues are being debated with the kind of nuance and care that's required, and with a deep understanding from both the tech companies, but also the politicians of what's really at stake.
Jeremy, thank you. That was really a very complete answer, and I think it does bring up some other questions, certainly that I have. I want to also remind our audience, both the live stream and our folks here on Zoom, that if there are questions that you have, please feel free to use the Q&A function, use the chat to send those to the panel. We will address those at the end of the presentation. One of the issues, and I'll go to Mehran next, the concept of automation and innovation. I think that as Jeremy mentioned, there is almost a presumption that government intervention would stifle innovation, would cause those creative minds to seek elsewhere for their solutions because the government is stifling, strangling that innovation. How, from your perspective as the resident technologist here, how do technologists accommodate that government intervention or regulation and still be creative in a way that truly is the American model and the American free enterprise system?
Yeah, I think the basic premise to start that, innovation is stifled by regulation is just kind of a misnomer to begin with. It's an easy phrase to throw out there as a way to kind of stave off regulation. But in reality, if you look at the creation of the internet, it was created by government funding, basically. It was created by the government wanting to create a different communications platform, putting a lot of research dollars into it. Eventually that turned into something that was commercial, and now we have a lot of activity on it. But it was because of government that we have it in the first place. When we think about the notion of regulation, it's important to keep in mind that what regulation is trying to do is just provide guardrails. Let me give you a simple analogy for that. When we had cars on the road, we didn't just say, go out and drive and try to be safe, and the only choice you have is whether you drive your car or not drive your car. What we did actually, in the early days, we did that, and a lot of people got killed. What we ended up doing was putting a bunch of regulations into place that said, we're going to have roadways, we're going to have speed limits, we're going to have stoplights. There was a set of regulations that made driving safer for everyone. There were still choices around if someone wanted to drive. There were still companies producing lots of cars, but now they were creating safer cars that had things like seatbelts in them. That's the same kind of place we're getting to with technology, is rather than just having technologists give us this kind of false choice of either you use the app or you don't use the app. That's the only choice you have. There's no reason why that choice can't be embedded in a larger structure that says, we're going to create more safety around it. We're going to give you more privacy by giving you control over more of your own data and how it actually gets used. That doesn't stifle innovation. Companies still want to be able to have customers on their platform. What it basically does is just provide some guardrails or rules as to how that data actually gets used. And so you can think of lots of examples of that down the line. When we think about things like algorithmic decision-making, it doesn't stop companies from producing algorithms that can make decisions if people also have a right for due process or right to inspect what those algorithms are doing or to challenge their decisions. It just creates a safer system for everyone. So I think in the long term, what we need to get to is an understanding that regulation actually is creating a better system. And if there are places where we feel like, and sometimes, this notion of what regulation is going to do is just entrench the big players because they're the only ones that have the resources to actually be able to accommodate those regulations. There's lots of examples of this even recently where regulations are written to allow for smaller companies, given that this is Denver Startup Week, to actually be able to generally operate unfettered until they reach a particular size. And the benefit of having regulations like that is it tells companies what's coming down the road if they want to get big. So rather than having a surprise later on where suddenly this regulation comes along and says, look, if you reach a certain size where that's determined by your number of customers or your revenue or your market capitalization, whatever it may be, there's intelligent ways to do that. When you get there, here's some regulations you need to abide by with respect to, for example, how you handle user data and what kind of guarantees you give to your users. So if you don't get big, it never becomes a problem because you're really not handling that much data. But if you do, you know what's coming down the line, you build the systems to be able to accommodate that. So everyone's better off in that system.
Alan, can I just hop in here for a second and add something?
Absolutely.
Because if the audience here is thinking, gosh, these Stanford professors are leaning into a bunch of government solutions and all of this invocation of democracy. One thing that if I were to put myself in the shoes of a venture capitalist or an early startup employee or founder, I'd be wondering, well, okay, so there's a civic role, possibly I could be persuaded, but what is it that I could do in my role as a venture capitalist or as a startup founder or an employee? And I want to make sure we put very squarely on the table, there's lots of things to do there too. We talked about the optimization mindset, and one of the things that we describe in the book is how there's a real temptation to think that when you're building a new product and trying to find a revenue stream for it, you just set the technologists to work and you kind of tweak and do A/B testing, you throw spaghetti at the wall, fake it till you'll make it, all these buzz phrases. And in the book, we talk about it's totally possible, in addition to hiring technologists, also to hire people who are social scientists, or for that matter, people with a philosophical background who could help everyone in the company identify some of these difficult decisions about the trade-offs. So, I mean, take, for example, there's a book that I think is pretty well known in the startup or tech community called Hooked, Hooked. And the subtitle of that book is How to Build Habit-Forming Products. It's a way in which technologists collaborate with social scientists, particularly behavioral economists or behavioral psychologists, to try to design the product in such a way as to addict you to it. The things that you could do at Stanford, there was a place where a lot of apps came out of called the Persuasive Technology Lab, which you might also worry could also be called the Manipulative Technology Lab. So it's not as if technologists are unfamiliar with working with social scientists. It's just that they've deployed them on behalf of hooking them on the product, trying to achieve great scale as soon as possible, and only downstream worry about some of the problematic, social consequences. Instead, as Jack Dorsey has said, the CEO of Twitter, he wishes that he had hired some social scientists far earlier in the startup days of Twitter to understand what the dynamic would have been to have a like button or a retweet button. Instead, it was just the addictive technologists at work. And there's lots of things as a consequence that a venture capital or a startup community can do to try to take stock of what would happen to us if we turn out to be hyper successful. What problems might we have to confront? And that would be better to have some internal capacity sooner rather than later.
Rob, thank you for that. And it brings up a related point, I think, which is the business models that we're talking about for these platforms that are the ones that are most frequently identified as the problematic ones, the social media companies, data privacy, all of those things. Regulation is one solution. Perhaps encouraging different business models might be a different one. I guess I'll probably go to Mehran first. But how do you incentivize these companies, as Rob is talking about, to reconsider perhaps a highly profitable or highly monetized business model that might have these pitfalls? How do you incentivize that review, as Jack Dorsey is indicating earlier in the process, to make sure that these problems don't snowball as a platform like Twitter grows from 1 million users to 1 billion users? How can that ethical outlook be baked into the startup process more effectively?
Right. Part of it, to get back to the optimization mindset, is choosing what you optimize and understanding what the net impact of that is, right? If you choose just to optimize for, say, click-throughs on ads, which is a common thing that many companies do, what are you trying to actually get people to do? That's a poor proxy for things like engagement. That's what we see on Facebook, right? Facebook really cares of what they say is we want to connect the world. How do they measure connecting the world? They measure it based on how often people interact with a piece of content, how many times they actually create a friend connection, how much time they spend on the platform. Those are generally poor proxies for really connecting the world, because I might be clicking on things because they're inflammatory to me. I might be spending more time on the network because I'm actually writing responses to things that make me angry. It turns out the research shows those are the pieces of content that I'm most likely to engage with, but that's not creating a more connected society. It's actually creating a more fractured society. And so part of being deliberate is understanding what is the goal and what is really being optimized in terms of those metrics, and trying to move from just the notion of shareholder capitalism that the only thing we care about is maximizing revenue, to think about stakeholder capitalism in the sense of how do we actually think about what the stakeholders involved need and how we can improve the condition for everyone. If companies choose not to do that, that's the place where regulations really needed to say that the externalities you're generating as a result of your product are worse for society overall. And so we need to rein in what's going on. But if we could actually have some companies take some steps along those lines to understand what's going on, as Rob alluded to, for example, employing social scientists, you actually get better outcomes in the long term too, because if we get some of these regulations that allow for data portability, that allow for more choice, what users are going to gravitate to are the platforms that actually provide the kind of experiences they think are positive. So if companies are thinking about that sort of double bottom line, how do we create the socially relevant outcomes? We may actually in the long term grow our customer base even more, because that's what their users actually want.
I just add, Alan, I think there
Yes.
are three ways that we're going to get changes in business models. The first is that we're going to get new founders of startups who basically say, I want to look at the impact of my products in ways differently than those who've come before me. That is, I want to redefine the bottom line of my company. And we already see that with the kind of B Corp movement and an effort of sort of a new generation of corporate leaders to take this seriously. The second is that you're going to have pressure from inside the companies themselves. Today, we saw that on display with respect to a Facebook whistleblower, but of course, that's only the most extreme example of this. We have all sorts of pressure that's happening inside companies themselves around who companies do business with, who they sell products to, how they engage China, and pressure inside companies from the most hotly contested commodity in Silicon Valley, which is engineering talent, right? That basically says, I feel profoundly uncomfortable with the orientation of this company. So the more that companies have this pressure from below that we're beginning to see emerge, that's also going to create change, I think, in business models. And then, of course, the third piece of the puzzle is the role of the state. And we've seen an orientation increasingly, although not yet bipartisan support, for changes around the expectations of what board membership means and who's represented on boards, and sort of efforts to instantiate in concrete ways what stakeholder capitalism might mean through regulation. Now, it's surely the case that startup founders and tech execs leaning into this is one natural way to fend off regulatory momentum. But let's also recognize that that's been the dynamic that we've been in for the last 10 years, which is just, we'll self-regulate, we've got this under control, we understand the concerns, and we're also reaching a point where there's not a lot of confidence in that.
And that's a great segue, Jeremy. So to that point, what happens if regulation makes no impact? If somehow regulation falls short of the objectives that I think many certainly in Congress might advocate, what happens if it has to cross into a more aggressive state role in terms of enforcement, or we've heard a conversation around breaking up some of these larger tech companies. What happens if regulation is not enough to solve the problems we're seeing?
Well, let me say a couple things about that. The first is that there is no silver bullet solution to the set of systemic problems that we describe, whether you think about them through the lens of Facebook, and there was some discussion today in the congressional hearing about breaking up Facebook, and the whistleblower suggested that she's not supportive of breaking up Facebook for a whole variety of reasons. But there's no single bullet solution to the full array of problems that we've talked about, even in the last 40 minutes. There are lots of sort of point-specific solutions around data privacy and how to respond to worker displacement related to AI, and what to do about transparency around algorithmic auditing. So let's not kid ourselves that there is going to be one regulatory solution to the diverse array of problems that we've discovered. And I think let's also not pretend that there's any realistic expectation that the set of solutions that we have will be comprehensive and complete and massively effective. This is going to proceed in fits and starts. We are entering a new moment where there is a push and pull between users who are concerned about technology and its effects, between citizens who are experiencing these harmful effects, between companies, and between regulators. And so you're going to have a dynamic that unfolds over the next decade and a half, a policy window where there is this kind of push and pull. Europe was about 5 years ahead of the game in getting started. And the question is going to be how the US comes to the table, given that most of these technology companies are headquartered in the US. But the third thing to say is that the concluding chapter of our book doesn't suggest that regulation is going to solve not only the near-term problems we confront, but also the problems that we can't anticipate yet. But that regulation is only one piece of a three-part sort of transformation that needs to happen. The first part is the cultivation of an ethic of responsibility in technology that really parallels the development of norms and standards that we've seen in the life sciences that were most obviously on display around CRISPR, where you need the leaders of this field to begin to draw lines about what is acceptable and what isn't acceptable, and what are your obligations when you are a technologist, in the same way that lawyers have obligations and doctors have obligations. They also have a profit motive when you run a law firm, when you run a health system, but you are bound by a set of constraints, and we have no parallel ethic of responsibility in tech. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The second piece of the puzzle is this changing model that's being debated in capitalism, a sort of set of companies that are far more responsive to a broader community of stakeholders and not only shareholders as they've been traditionally defined. And some of that will come from pressure from below, some of that will come from leaders in the sector. And then the third piece is a democracy that's capable of governing technology, which means not just focusing on data privacy and automation and algorithmic auditing, the set of issues of today, content moderation, but figuring out what it means to design a set of democratic institutions that have the technical expertise and know-how to go toe-to-toe with the technologists of the future, not just the technologists of today. And so that means that people who care about this problem in the long run can't just concern themselves with antitrust enforcement, but they have to concern themselves with the fact that our federal civil service and our advisory bodies for Congress simply don't have access to technical talent that would enable our elected officials and our executive branch officials to regulate tech with an independent view towards the public interest that's separate and distinct from what's presented to them by lobbyists. So we need progress on all three of those fronts simultaneously.
Alan, I just want to hop in here one more time and add a coda to all this, which is that, if after listening to this for the past 30 minutes, you're thinking to yourself something like, gosh, the problem is systemic, it's complicated, there's different fronts, there's no silver bullet solution. Like, one of our ways of responding to that is yes, any genuinely interesting and difficult problem will not be solved simply. And I mean, I sometimes hesitate to say this, but the spirit of the book, which we hope, animates people who are potential readers, is that if you're sick and tired of reading headlines about how psychopathic Mark Zuckerberg is or is not, or Elizabeth Holmes lied and cheated her way to the top of Theranos, and that's the problem with big tech that society should be most concerned about, and you think to yourself, those are just not interesting ways of thinking about these extraordinarily powerful technical tools and the extraordinarily powerful companies that now wield them, then our book is for you. Like, we're not going to give you a simple solution. It's a book for people who are knowledgeable or want to be knowledgeable about how we got into the mess we're in, and then various different things we need to do that will not happen overnight to get us out of the mess, to do something which we all agree upon. The digital revolution has extraordinary benefits to deliver for all people, if only we can put some guardrails in place that minimize the harms and break the decision-making out of companies alone.
And I appreciate that perspective, significantly, Rob. Thank you for adding that. I think that one of the things that your book does so effectively is it divides conversation of this topic to not just the corporate side, but talking about individuals. And these companies are obviously comprised of individuals with certain motivations. We have a question from one of our attendees that states, you all are clearly identifying important systemic issues, but how, as an individual, do you try to bring ethics into your decisions when the incentives for career advancement / businesses are misaligned? So it's not just the profit motivation for a company. Folks in this space, perhaps our attendees here, are interested in building something that they can be proud of, that can be sustainable. As an individual, as a technologist, how do you take that motivation and advance your career when these are the most prized jobs in the field, working for a Facebook or an Instagram or a Twitter or another large tech platform? How do you reconcile that social good with your career advancement? Mehran, I see you unmuted. I'll go to you first.
Well, having spent a decade in the tech industry, I think there's a few things to keep in mind as an individual. One of them is what kind of impact you can have in the company in terms of helping them find business goals that align with what you think are ethically sound practices. Oftentimes in companies, they have things like KPIs, key performance indicators, or OKRs, objectives and key results, that are the things that employees are evaluated by. But employees can also have a role, especially if employees have some seniority at the company or they just have talent that the company needs, which is more and more what we've been seeing, and Jeremy and Robert alluded to, that engineers actually have a lot more power than they think because they are in such high demand by these companies. To be able to bring your views in to say, here are the things I think should be part of the performance indicators that we need to measure. These are some of the things we need to be evaluated on. If you see the company actually provides pushback for those things, then you need to take a hard look at, is this a company you want to work for, that their values are so misaligned with yours that they're not even willing to entertain the conversation or listen to you in terms of potentially trying to move the moral compass of the company in a different direction. And that's a place where I think engineers find they have more power than they think they do. Sometimes they think they're powerless and they're just being dictated to, but in fact, a good manager will listen to the engineers on their team. A good director will listen to their managers as to what are the kinds of things, the directions the product should actually get pushed. Because in the long term, many of these decisions, if you actually move that moral compass, aren't just about the bottom line today. They're about what is the growth of the business in the long term and how you make a case for that to say that these are the kinds of things that consumers actually want. If we can better align with providing that kind of value to consumers, it means a long-term growth in our business, which is more important than just what is the bottom line today.
Ron, thank you. Rob, I don't know if you want to contribute anything in terms of the ethical perspective, not from the operational side, as Mehran's talking about, but more as the self-motivation to career advancement, success in this field. When they're so aligned with the larger business goals, how do you derive that personal satisfaction and reconcile those things?
Yeah, I'll give two big picture perspectives here on that. But I want to start by underscoring something Mehran said, because I think in this particular conversation it's so important, which is, we're talking about a domain of employees, people with technical skills, engineers, who are extremely valuable to the companies that they work for. There's enormous competition over the 10x programmer or the 100x coder. And as a consequence of that, relative scarcity, there's more power in the employee whose views, if they're somewhat at odds with their supervisors or the company leaders, there's a cost to be paid by that company if a whole bunch of people were to leave. So more agency available for people in technology than might be the case in a bunch of other companies. All right, big picture perspective. What happens when there's an incentive misalignment between the profit motive that might be driving a corporation in the marketplace and a set of ethical concerns about what it would mean to do the right thing or to do try to steer things for what socially is good rather than just financially maximizes return? One part of me wants to begin by saying, well, welcome to living as an adult, in which we live in different domains of life and we have incentive structures that push and pull us in different ways. And what part of you ever thought that you were going to live a life in which there was no tension involved? So it's hardly a novel circumstance to feel like in one part of our life, there's an incentive structure to push in one direction, and another part of our life, a different direction. And now we have to make a choice. That's what it is to encounter the moral complexity of living any ordinary adult life. So that's just in certain respects to diminish the stakes involved. Oh my gosh, the company is a for-profit place. It keeps driving towards profit, but I have this moral compass. I want to do good. Okay, again, we're just sort of confronting the ordinary moral complexity of any life. Next, well, I think the key here is then to think beyond just, I want to put in place some sort of ironclad guardrails. Like there's a point that I will personally not go beyond. Those are valuable. So let's say you happen to be developing facial recognition technology for a company, a huge important frontier, massive commercial interests involved. And you said to yourself, yeah, this is a good and important technology, but do I want my labor to be deployed on behalf of a product that my company might sell to a military that was using that facial recognition technology to target people through a drone weapon? And you think to yourself, no, for me, that's a bright line. So Then in circumstances where you feel like it's just going way beyond what your own conscience will permit, you draw a bright line and you say very clearly to yourself, if the company does this, then I'm leaving. But beyond those relatively few bright lines, there's just a way of then saying, this is not just about you and your moral conscience, but as Jeremy put it before, an ethic of responsibility that binds technologists together as a whole. And that's what I think we should strive to push for. I mean, to put it maybe in a corny way, if you work for a company that trumpets its social responsibility, I don't think being ethical should be a competitive marketplace advantage. You know, like go work for the company that more often than not makes a set of what you would consider ethical choices. Any company should want to lift the ethics of the entire sector in order to make sure that the balance of the effects of technology on society are better rather than worse. So what does that mean? That just means engaging in conversations with your fellow employees, wondering what their views are, and then trying to figure out ways in which to navigate, you know, what we from a distant perspective can't do on your behalf, the internal politics of your particular organization, the details of the technological, you know, product you're working on. And then ensure that you're not just drawing an individual line for yourself, but trying to coordinate the behavior of those around you by engaging in conversation. And when we've taught versions of our class to people in the tech industry, one of the things we found over and over again is that some people who thought, maybe I'm one of the only ones who is really worried about something we're doing, now find that there's a much larger community and there are lots of people to talk to. That doesn't mean an automatic solution is on offer, but these days, you know, 5+ years into the tech backlash, lots of people have concerns. Go find others around you to talk to. And that might be a productive path forward as well.
Thank you very much. We do have one more question from an attendee, then I'll give each of you the last word as we look to wrap up here on time. The question focuses really on the pace of these conversations perhaps slowing around the pandemic, that if there was motivation around regulation or controlling social media, putting people in their homes for 18 months might have slowed that incentive because people rely more heavily perhaps on a social media platform or a tech platform to connect with friends and family or perhaps even do their job. Perhaps we'll start with Jeremy and then maybe go to Mehran for some comments, but have you seen the impacts of the pandemic in terms of motivation or incentive to further regulate this industry?
I mean, big tech won the pandemic is something that people have said, right? What are the companies that have done best out of the pandemic? Where have we seen growing wealth rather than shrinking wealth and economic opportunity, you know, in this very difficult period in the United States and around the world? And of course, it's cemented our understanding of our dependence on these technologies. But no one should interpret anything about the arguments that we're making or our book as somehow anti-technology. We spend a lot of our time teaching future technologists because we are true believers in the potential of technology and the effects of technology, positive. Many were on display in the pandemic as we shifted our lives entirely into a virtual world. But the pandemic also happened alongside the 2020 presidential election, which was yet another development that cemented our understanding of just how much power is concentrated in the hands of a small number of individuals to make choices that impact all of us about what's allowed on their platforms, what's not allowed on their platforms, what happens to information, whether it's fraudulent information that's false about fraudulent elections and stolen elections, or, you know, fake news about COVID vaccines and their harmful effects or their origins and microchips that are embedded in them and the like. And so in this moment of a global pandemic and real threats to American democracy that none of us have experienced in our lives, we've seen the best that technology has on display, but also the profound harms that these new technologies generate in society. And if anyone is walking away from this moment without some sense of discomfort, that we have basically given up our sort of decision-making authority and power over these decisions to the technologists themselves, they need to wake up, because this is a moment at which those social harms that are on display, whether it relates to democracy or well-being or the ability to generate vaccine uptake, these are all social harms that are the result of individual decisions and corporate incentives. And that is what calls for an appropriate role for government. And now we need our democracy to get into the game.
And
Appreciate
just
that.
quickly,
Please,
what
Ron.
I'd add to it is that, what we saw is that certain values got highlighted during the pandemic too, and that helps raise the level of discourse. So one of the things that happened is that some of the companies stepped up, for example, to build contact tracing apps. And the idea there was to try to slow the spread of the pandemic. But when you build a contact tracing app, what that very much highlights is the value of privacy, and it brings that to the fore. And so it also helped actually spur a conversation both among consumers as to how their privacy was actually being treated if they were to use a contact tracing app. But it also highlights that conversation in companies to think about, if privacy is a value we care about in this instance, perhaps that same value needs to carry over to some of the other things we build as well. So I think, the flip side of it, where we also saw things like, apps like DoorDash, where they got a huge surge in usage. And at the same time, those companies that were benefiting from that usage wanted to carve out the ability of the delivery people from being considered employees and being able to participate in benefits as an employee of the company. And so that also highlighted, I think, a larger consumer discussion around what do we actually think about the rights of those employees, and where do we want to have some regulation to think about those employees or contractors as they're treated now actually being able to participate more fully as employees of those companies. So the conversations, I think, went in multiple directions, but there were some places where I think we actually saw an acceleration of some of the issues that need to be dealt with.
Thank you very much, both for that. Those responses. We are at time, so I want to give each of you just a quick closing word, maybe a piece of advice to technologists or aspiring technologists, how to engage more ethically in this field, and then we'll close the panel. So we'll start with Jeremy.
So I think the bottom line for us is that we are agents of our technological future. It will not happen to us. Without us deciding whether to play a role in it or continuing to operate in passive ways that allow those decisions to be made by others. And we are agents of that technological future because we are users of products, because we are designers of products, because we are investors that fund companies, because we are citizens in a democracy that has the ability to hold our elected officials accountable. And the challenge at this moment is to exercise that agency if you're concerned about the social harms that we see all around us.
Jeremy, thank you. Why don't we go to Mehran next?
So I think, despite all of the kind of negativity that sometimes gets associated with thinking about the problems in big tech, I think for me, it's a message of hope, which is to actually understand now more the problems that are taking place, but also understanding pathways to solutions and actually finding ways to make the system better for everyone. So we're on that precipice now. We can, if we continue down the same path, we're going to get more of these negative externalities. But given that we've identified them and we've also identified ways forward, we can actually make some progress and get to a better outcome.
Thank you very much. And Rob, I'll give you the last word.
Sure, I'll just be simple. One of the things that I think is so striking about our moment is that for anyone at Denver Startup Week, you already know that these technological tools and skills can have extraordinary power. That's just what makes the moment so potent. It's not like when I graduated from college and the thing to do was to go off to Wall Street or a management consulting firm. Getting AI skills, getting technical skills gives you a chance with, very little infrastructure costs, software startups, that type of thing. A couple people can launch, a company that within the space of a year acquires millions of users, if you do things well. And that very premise is part of what we think gives technology its power, but also has to come with responsibility. So this idea that Jeremy began with, we all have some agency, no matter where we sit in the system, as citizens, as users, as founders, as venture capitalists. Be aware of that agency and accept the responsibility that goes along with the power that people have in technology.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all, Mehran, Jeremy, Rob, thank you on behalf of Denver Startup Week for contributing not just this book, which is such an important, critical, interdisciplinary approach to this this challenge, but for being here today and for gracing us with your expertise and your thoughts on where we stand as a society. Tattered Cover is proud to be a partner of Denver Startup Week and a sponsor. The book is available at tatteredcover.com, and we are excited to see you guys next year in another presentation like this one. Again, thank you all for being here. To our panelists, thank you. And to Denver Startup Week, thank you so much for all you do to advance the cause of technology in our city. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Thanks
Take
for
care.
having us.